You're listening to the weekly Parsha podcast, recorded with Hashem's never-ending assistance in Ramat Beit Shemesh, Israel, 5775, 2015. This week's Parsha is Parsha's Vaeschanan, and in this week's Parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu, he has a speech which goes on for a few weeks, and we have it at this entire Sefer of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, is the speech. It's kind of a recap of many of the halachas, many of the laws, much of the hashkafa, the Torah's outlook. What does it mean, a relationship with God? And Moshe Rabbeinu reminds us in this week's Parsha about our relationship with Hashem. He reminds us in this week's Parsha about the experience that we had at Mount Sinai, receiving the Torah. Now, what's interesting is there's two distinctly different descriptions of our relationship, as I understand it, as we read the Parsha. And I'd like to share with you these two different ways, and I'd like to try to understand them. What is the difference between them? And perhaps show how at the root, these two different ways that we interact with Hashem are really truly can be united. You can see how they touch each other and perhaps they're united. Now Moshe Rabbeinu tells us that the laws, the teachings that he's given over, that Hashem has given through him for the Jewish people, these teachings, is so important to keep them. These teachings, the Torah, don't add on to it, don't subtract from it. And it's something that the nations of the world will see. They will understand objectively that the power, the beauty, the wisdom of the Jewish people is in their commitment to this relationship that they have with Hashem, as expressed in the Torah. Now, he says, this is in chapter 4, verse 7, as a continuation of this concept, he says, Kimi goy gadol, which other great nation, asher lo Elokim kroivim elav, has God so close to them, Hashem Elokeinu, b'chol koreinu elov, like Hashem our God, in all of that which we call out to Him. Umi goy gadol asher lechukim u'mishpatim tzadikim, which other nation has such powerful, righteous, proper statutes and laws, k'chol ha'torah hazayis, like all of His Torah, asher anochi nosin lefnechem hayom, which I am placing before you today. And then the next thing that he says, the next words, is Rak yishomer lecha u'shmor nafshecha ma'od. Be very, very careful. Not to forget. Don't forget what you yourself saw. And it shouldn't go out of your heart all of your days. And make sure to tell it to your children and your grandchildren. About the day that you stood before God at Mount Chorev, which is another name for Mount Sinai. And then Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, goes on to give us a whole description of that amazing experience that the Jewish people had. 1.5 million people experienced an open spiritual revelation of Hashem in the world, through which Hashem gave the beginning of the Ten Commandments, which all the Jewish people heard. And then, as we'll soon see, the Jewish people asked that the revelation was just too great. It was too much for them to handle. And they asked that it be limited. After the second commandment, Moshe Rabbeinu, they asked, Moses, you be the one to give us the information. Hashem should reveal himself to you. You can handle it. We can't. And so the revelation changed. But before we get there, I'd like to point out a few different things here. It's interesting, Moshe Rabbeinu, in describing or in giving us an introduction to the Maimon Har Sinai, to what the Jewish people had experienced, and telling them that they have to repeat it and remind their children about it, that very experience that they had. Before telling us about that experience, Moshe says to us, which other nation, who else has this type of relationship with Hashem? Which other whole nation has a God who is so close to them as Hashem your God, or Hashem our God, when we call out to Him? So there's 2 points in this pasuk, in this verse, that I'd like to point out. The first is that Hashem is close to us, b'chol koreinu elav, in all of our calling out to Him. The first mode of relationship that's described in this week's Parsha in regards to how we interact with Hashem is Hashem is always available for us. B'chol koreinu elav. No matter where we are, no matter what our situation is, we can always call out to God, and Hashem will answer, Hashem will be there for us. And that's a unique relationship. It's not something which was existent at the time. They had all these avodah zaros, they had idolatry. The only way to get the favor of the idolatry and to get your needs met was to bring human sacrifice, or to give up something crazy for the gods, so to speak. That was what was the pagan worship at the time. The concept of a single God is a concept which Avram Avinu, Abraham, came upon, and the Jewish people brought into the world through the Torah, through this revelation. And so, but the amazing thing about it here is that Hashem is always available for us. Now, what's interesting, and this is a second point, it's really important to understand this, and it's very much connected, is that the pasuk, in speaking about God right here, it refers to him as Elokim. Now, you've heard from me before that the word Elokim, which is God, it's the word that means God, is plural. It's plural, and interestingly, usually when it uses the word Elokim, or Elokenu, the descriptive word, Elokim diber, let's say, God spoke. So the word diber is singular, because it's God. God really, even though the word is for God is plural, but it's speaking about a singular entity, which is God. And so the descriptive word, or the verb, or whatever it is singular. Now what's unusual in this verse, and the Medrash points it out, and we'll get to the Medrash soon, but what's unusual here is that in the description, in the adjective of the word Elokim, it refers to God as a God who is close. Elokim krevim elav. A God who is close to the nation of the Jewish people. Now the word krovim is also plural. So it's interesting, because Elokim is a plural word which refers to God, who is a singular entity. But in this verse, the adjective, instead of being singular, is plural. And in fact, the Medrash brings a conversation between Rabbi Simlai and a group of heretics who kept trying to prove from the Torah that God is not singular, that God is not one, but rather there's multiple facets. This is something that even to this day, there are certain faiths that would like to prove that you can have multiple facets of God or multiple manifestations of God, even in a physical form, which is completely against the Jewish approach to God. God does not take on a physical form. God does not manifest as a human being, as a single human being. There's no such thing in Judaism. In fact, it's considered idolatry. But so these idolaters or heretics, they came to Rabbi Simlai and said, look, God's name is plural here. This shows that there's multiple gods. And not only that, they proved from the fact that it says the word krovim. The gods are close. And krovim is a reference to many gods. They are close. And so Rabbi Simlai responded and said, but you have to look at the second half of the pasuk. It says, Hashem Elokeinu, like Hashem our God b'chol kareinu, a love, in all of our calling to Him, which is singular. So Rabbi Simlai showed them that whenever you have a verse which seems to refer to God in the plural, it's always going to be referenced at some point in the verse in the singular. Now, what we need to understand here is two things. First of all, why indeed is the name of Hashem, is the name of God, plural? Why is it Elokim, which sounds like multiple forces, multiple gods? Why is God, singular, referred to in a plural? Also, why in this pasuk is Elokim krovim, they are close? Why does it use indeed the plural form in reference to Hashem? And specifically in the context of this pasuk, of this verse, what's the teaching? What's the idea? Now, before we tackle these questions, this pasuk, try to understand it, I'd like to direct your attention to a pasuk later on, the pasukim later on, that speak about a different mode of relationship with Hashem, which we mentioned. And that is the way that the Jewish people interacted with God at Mount Sinai, at Har Sinai. The pasuk tells us that the Jewish people came to Moshe, they came to Moses with a taina, with a statement which was a challenge, and they said, we heard the first two of the dibros of the Ten Commandments, we heard them directly from the mouth of God. 1.5 million people had that experience. And now, but they said, it's too much for us. As the Medrash tells us, they had an out-of-body experience. Literally, all of the Jewish people died as a result of having this exposure to Hashem, to God, and this open manifestation. Their souls just left their bodies. Hashem had to bring them back to life twice. And they said like this is in Pasuk, in Perek Hey, in chapter 5, verse 22. V'ata, and now, Lama namus, why should we die? Kisechlenu ha'ish hagedol hazois, this incredibly powerful fire, which was the fire of Mount Sinai, the fire that came down, as this whole entire amazing experience occurred. They said, we're gonna get consumed by this fire, by this spiritual fire. If we continue to hear God's voice in this way, we're going to die. Kimi, says the next verse, who? Kol basar sheshama kol Elokim chayim medaber mitoch ha'esh kamoinu vayechi. Who else has been able to experience this open revelation of God and to be able to continue to live like this? No one else has been able to do this. We don't believe that we're going to be able to continue this way. And in fact, as a result of this, this request or this statement of the Jewish people, Hashem instructs Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was a little bit perturbed. The Jewish people should hear it directly from God. Why should they have to hear it through me? And he was correct in a certain sense, but Hashem says to him, no, there's truth to what they're saying. They're afraid, they have a fear of this open revelation, and their fear is well founded. And indeed, the continuation, the rest of the Torah was given to Moshe, and it was repeated to the Jewish people. And they didn't hear it directly from God himself. But what's interesting is that what comes out from what we see here is that there are two different modes of relationship with Hashem. The mode that we see over here in the second part of the Parsha, which is a reference to what happened at Mount Sinai, is where a person has an open revelation of Hashem. Where a person has this massive fire and thunder and lightning and this amazing experience of God. And that experience of God is something which is built in Isbal. It's not easy, or it's almost impossible to be able to sustain. However, what's the other mode of our relationship? It's the relationship which we spoke about before. That who else, which other nation has a relationship with Hashem that God is close to them in all of their calling out? Which means that, in a certain sense, Hashem comes down from the heavens and the heavens part and there's this massive display. That's Mount Sinai. But in another sense, Hashem is always here, always next to me, always close to me. Is the revelation there intense? Is the relationship there massive and overpowering? No, it's not. But so we see that there's two different modes. One is this overpowering, intense, massive revelation, massive relationship with God, and it's something which is almost impossible to withstand, to be able to experience. And then there's a second type of relationship which is consistently available, and the person can indeed be able to interact with Hashem at that level without losing his life, without losing his existence in this world. Now what's interesting is that Hashem's intent when it came to this revelation at Mount Sinai, at Har Sinai, was indeed that the Jewish people should have a direct revelation of Hashem, not just for the first two, but clearly for the entire Torah, at least for the 10 Commandments, for the Aseret HaDibros. And that's something that you see because if they wouldn't have asked, if they wouldn't have complained and said to Moshe, we can't handle this, it would have continued that way. Now, Moshe's response is very interesting. Rashi tells us, and there's a hint from it in the Pasuk, in chapter 5, verse 24, the Jewish people say to Moshe, you speak to us. We can't hear it directly from God. Now, when they say you, the word for you in this particular verse is ve'at. Instead of ve'ata and you, male, they say ve'at, you female. And many times, when the Torah uses the female version in a spot where it's supposed to be male, so our Chazal, our sages, will make a drasha. They will say that it comes to teach us something. And Rashi tells us that what does it come to teach us? That he lost his power. Just like a female, physically, in regards to a man, generally speaking, women aren't as physically strong as men. So here there was a weakening that Moshe Rabbeinu had as a result of their request. Let's read Rashi inside. He says, Hitashtem eskoichi kenekeva. You caused me to be weakened like a female. Shenitzta'arti aleichem. Because I was very disturbed because of you, or on your behalf. V'ripisem es yadi, and you weakened my hand. Ki raisi she'enchem charedim liskari v'elav me'ava. I saw that you weren't shaking, you weren't fearful to come close to him. You didn't have that level of fear to come close to God with love. Very interesting thing the Rashi is saying. Let's continue in the Rashi, just finish it up before we come back to this point. You didn't want to learn directly from Hashem, and you wouldn't want, it seems, to learn from me either. And the point that I want to focus in on and see is that it would have been possible. Rashi is telling us that Moshe is saying, it would have been possible for the Jewish people to have an open, complete revelation of Hashem through ahava, through chareda be'ahava, through a balance of fear with deep, deep love. If the Jewish people had enough, perhaps, belief in themselves, belief in God's love for them, if they would have believed that Tchias HaMesim, that revival of the dead, would have continued to happen over and over again, if they would have believed that the love was there between themselves and God, they could have heard the entire Torah directly from Hashem. But now that they were unable to hear it directly from Hashem, it seems from the end of Rashi, they wouldn't be able to even hear it from Moshe either. Now I'd like to point out that these two different modes of relationship, at least I can speak for myself, I know that I would love it if Hashem would just reveal himself openly and I would have this intense experience of God and I'd be inspired and that would be that relationship that I would have with him all the time. Now, clearly from this pasuk, it's not something which is generally possible. But clear from Rashi that if a person is on a certain level and has a balance between this yira and ava, between awe and love of God, if a person has a truly deep love of himself and of God and an understanding of God's love for him, so then it's possible to have indeed that exalted relationship. But what's important to understand is that this is something which is a very high level, and it's not something that we can all attain. Perhaps we can aspire to it, but it's not something that we can all attain. But there's a Pesach, there's a beautiful thing here, that we have a way out. It's possible to enter into a relationship with Hashem, which is also constant, which is also, Hashem is revealing himself to us. Perhaps not in an intense way, like Maimon Har Sinai, like what we experienced at Mount Sinai, but there is a relationship which is possible all the time. Hashem can be with us all of the time. And this brings us back to the previous verse and the questions that we asked. We wanted to understand, why is it that Hashem, that Elokim, one of the names of God, is this plural name? And we wanted to understand, why is the adjective there? Kurayvim, they are close. What does that mean, or what is the idea behind it? Hashem is one. There's only one God. There's not multiple gods. There's not multiple manifestations. There's only one God. Why is the name Hashem plural? And the answer is, as our Chazal tell us, that Elokim, the name Elokim denotes the fact that Hashem is the Baal HaKoches Kulam, that God is the one who has all of the powers. Meaning, we look at the world, we look around us and there are so many powers, there are so many things. There's thunder, and there's lightning, and there's the sun which is powerful, and there's the rain which is powerful. There's so many different things that contribute to our lives and that are powerful. There's so many koiches, so many powers in the world. And as our Chazal also tell us, there's the stars, they have power, spiritual power. Hashem sends the Shefa, he sends down the influx of spirituality through the stars. It's something that we learn in Derech Hashem, it's brought down, the Ramchal speaks about it at length. The sun, the moon, each of these things have different powers. Now, the mistake is to believe that they have independent power. That was the Avdei Kachavim, the ones who worshipped idols, and they worshipped the stars, they worshipped the sun. They believe that these things have independent power separate from God. But in the Torah, in our teachings, so that's not true. They don't have separate power. They are all rooted in God. God is the Baal HaKoches Kulam. God, it seems as if there are many different manifestations of God, but they are all rooted in God himself. There's one God. And on the surface of it, the way we experience of it, there seems to be an angry God perhaps sometimes, or a loving God perhaps sometimes. There are many seeming manifestations or faces of God. But all of them are really not, there aren't many gods. There's only one God. But we experience God in many different ways. And that's our experience of God. And that's why we refer to him as Elokim, because we experience him in these many different ways. And I think that the statement that Hashem is Kurayvim, why does it say that it's Kurayvim, that they are close? I think that the concept here is that we experience God being close to us in many different situations, just like we experience many different aspects of God or many different manifestations of God. So too, sometimes we experience God's closeness to us in our moments of joy. Sometimes we experience God's closeness to us in our moments of sadness and in our moments of danger. In many different situations we find ourselves in, God manifests in all of those different situations, but always it's b'chol kareinu, a love. When it comes to the reference to God himself, yes, we experience him in many different ways or many different situations, but when we're talking about him and we're calling out to him, it's always singular. The Torah refers to God as singular because it's always rooted. Hashem is always one. And we may experience him differently in different situations, but there's only one God. A very good mashal for the bottom line of what I want to bring out from this is the concept of tal. Tal means dew, D-E-W, dew. In Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, so it rains in the winter, but in the summer, there's no rain. But what always is there, what's always accessible, is the dew. In the morning, early in the morning, the water condenses from within the air, and it coats everything with a fine layer of water. That's dew. And dew is something, as opposed to Geshem, as opposed to rain, which is more comparable to the experience at Mount Sinai, at Har Sinai, where it's something which is intense, and it's something which of course gives life. The dew is something which is always accessible. It's not dependent on any merit. It's not dependent on anything. It's something which is for everyone, and it's everywhere. And I think that that's a very good analogy for us to understand the concept of Elokim, b'chol kareinu elov, that Hashem is there He's always there, no matter where we are, no matter what our situation is, and no matter what we are doing, and no matter what we're up to. Hashem is always there when we call out to him. Is it going to be intense? It's not going to be the rain. It's not going to be Mount Sinai. But is he there? Yes. And is he accessible? Yes. And is it everywhere? Is Hashem everywhere? Is Hashem always available to us? Yes. Now, what's required in order to access that is a certain level of humility. It's a certain level of recognition. Hey, a person might say, that's not enough for me. I want that open revelation. I want God to reveal himself. Fire and thunder and lightning, that's what I want. I want to see it openly. But to be able to see that Hashem is there with me, even, this to a small degree, which is really a great degree, because Hashem is always there. Hashem is always with me. That requires a greater level of humility, of willingness to see and to look and to believe that indeed Hashem is there, that Hashem is helping me. B'chol kareinu elov, in all of our calling out to him. We might not always see it, we might not even sense it, but it's always there. It's subtle, but it's constantly there. If we look for it, if we're willing to have the humility to believe that we deserve it, or even said better, that even though we may not deserve it, we have a chelak elokam in us. We have a piece of God inside of us. So whether or not we deserve it, Hashem is always going to give it to us. Hashem is always going to reveal himself to us, to help us, to be there with us, no matter what. And I think that this is why Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, before he even speaks about the Ma'amad Har Sinai, that open revelation, he wants us to know that the open revelations, the intense revelations are amazing, are beautiful, are important. But what's more important is to preface that with the fact that Hashem is always with us, and that it requires a level of humility, as we've said, to be able to see that, to be willing to accept that and to receive it, and to appreciate it. I want to bless you. Please bless me back. Hashem should help us to be able to call out to him in all of our situations, to be able to indeed have those experiences, those high experiences, those open revelations, but to also have the humility to see that there's an open revelation that's always available to us at every moment, no matter what our situation. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful Shabbos. This podcast was made possible through the gracious donations of listeners like you. For more podcasts like this, please visit www.arigoldwag.com or search on iTunes Ari Goldwag.